Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us for Planning in the Opioid Epidemic. I just wanted to start with some housekeeping. Please send questions using the chat box on the right-hand side of the screen. You can use this box to send questions throughout the presentation. There's no need to wait till the end to ask questions. You can send them throughout. We will have a Q&A at the end of both presentations. The webinar is being recorded, and you will get a copy of the recording in the next couple of days. And the webinar is also available for 1 CM credit, including 0.5 law credits. So this webinar is the final in a 3-part series on planning in the opioid epidemic. The first 2 webinars are also available for on-demand CM credits on YouTube. The first webinar was an introduction to planning in the opioid epidemic. It lays out the common terms of healthy community design, APA's effort in greater detail, and looks at the opioid epidemic through a public health framework. It highlights some of the efforts underway from the National Association of Counties around the opioid epidemic as well. The second webinar included strategies to addressing the overdose crisis from Rhode Island, including some GIS mapping tools, and a town-gown partnership to create a treatment center in Tennessee and some of the difficulties found in that process. Today's webinar will start with me giving a short introduction to APA's healthy community design efforts. Then we're going to hear about trauma-informed community development planning from the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia and explore legal issues involved in zoning and recovery for residences in sober living homes. APA has been involved in healthy communities for a while and has a lot of great resources through their Planning and Community Health Center. The Healthy Communities Collaborative is an American Planning Association interest group of planners and allied professionals who are interested in fostering cross-sector collaboration and increasing capacity to support building healthy communities through local, regional, state, and national levels. As an interest group, you do not have to be an APA member to participate, and APA encourages outside professions to join the collaborative so that we can meet our goal of fostering cross-sectoral collaboration. There are 3 subcommittees, so you can get involved in the area of your particular interest. Here's the contact information for the Healthy Communities Collaborative. You can find it via email or Facebook, and it'll also be available in the recording. So Healthy Community Design strives to make the healthy choice the easy choice for members of every community. We can see how the work we do as planners affects our health in a variety of ways. I think we can all relate to the countless ways that planning affects the health of the communities that we help create. And another key to healthy communities, and particularly related to the opioid epidemic and substance abuse, are issues around social equity, where residents are engaged and the community feels safe. There's less issues with substance abuse, and those are healthier communities. Our efforts need to be inclusive and diverse. APA and the American Public Health Association worked on a multi-year effort to further healthy community design called Plan for Health. There were rounds of location-specific efforts and a final round where 28 APA chapters worked at the chapter level to promote healthy community design. I managed the project in Pennsylvania, and we surveyed county planning directors from around the state. In the results, we see the greatest needs identified by county planners in red, and those areas where planners felt they could affect change in blue. And I think we can see with substance abuse the greatest disparity, where there was a huge problem in a lot of our communities, both rural, urban, and suburban in Pennsylvania, but planners felt they were not able to address the issue. There's been much less research done on this issue of substance abuse than other healthy community design topics such as active transportation or access to healthy food. And I think we can see Pennsylvania, while being above average in the drug overdose rate, largely related to the opioid epidemic, but there are a lot of other states facing similar issues, and that led through the Planners for Health process of those states working together to try to identify resources, and that's what directly led to this webinar series. But even if your state is not one of those that is particularly facing this issue, it is an issue around the country. Deaths are still increasing and have become a huge issue everywhere. Just for a point of comparison, motor vehicle traffic deaths in the U.S. were 10.9 per 100,000 population, while drug overdose rates are 19.8 per 100,000 population and rising. Planners know of many tools to help address motor vehicle traffic deaths, but are still trying to discover ways to address the increasing opioid epidemic, which leads us to today's webinar. Today's speakers are Jamie Granger, who's an associate with Interface Studio, an urban planning and design practice based in Philadelphia. His recent work includes a community plan for the Kensington neighborhood in Philadelphia, which we will hear about today. Daniel Lauber, AICP, is both a planner and fair housing zoning attorney who pioneered the use of spacing distances between group homes allowed as of right. He also wrote APA's guidelines for zoning for community residences. So I'm going to hand it over to Jamie.
Okay, thanks Justin for the introduction. Again, I'm Jamie Granger, associate at Interface Studio, urban planning and design firm in Philadelphia. About a year and a half ago, we were hired to conduct a neighborhood strategic plan for the Kensington neighborhood in Philadelphia, which has really been hard hit by the opioid crisis. So I'm really just going to walk you through the project and share with you some of the insight we learned while working in the community. It looks like I'm having trouble progressing the slides, so if someone could progress for me, that'd be great. Thanks. So just a quick agenda, give you a little background to the project, some context to the neighborhood, then get into the approach we took, and some specific recommendations and implementation. So our team, it was funded by a Wells Fargo Regional Foundation planning grant. Our client was Impact Services. They're a social service organization in the neighborhood. They do everything from workforce development to housing for homeless veterans. Again, our team was Interface Studio. We work with Lamar Wilson from Wilson Associates. And the project took place in the fall of 2016 and really lasted for about a year. So this is the context of the neighborhood. This outline is the city of Philadelphia. The Kensington neighborhood is about 3.5 miles northeast of City Hall. When you zoom in closer, you can begin to see a little more detail of our neighborhood. There's a lot of rail infrastructure, both freight and public transit. There's easy access into Center City. It's really a dense row house neighborhood that you see across the city. There's some major parks. Our study area was really shaped by some other planning efforts. So all told, it's about 360 acres and close to 22,000 residents. So there's really an interesting history in this neighborhood. At one point, it was one of the largest textile mill districts in the world. Really helped Philadelphia gain the moniker of Workshop of the World. But as so often happens, as industry leaves these neighborhoods, economic decline kind of follows. So this is really where we're at today. About 14% of the study area is vacant buildings and lots. It's a largely Hispanic population. A lot of households run by single mothers, low levels of educational attainment, very low incomes, and close to 60% of households live below the poverty line. So the neighborhood's really made up of these dualities. Depending on your perspective, things could either be seen in a positive or negative light. A great example of this is some of the old industrial buildings. Negatively, they're seen as blights on the neighborhood, areas of where illicit activities occurs. But on the flip side, these are really great assets and opportunities for this community, for new affordable housing or workspace. These are just a few examples of some redevelopment already taking place. So this is a new construction heat map of the city. Some of the highest concentration of new development in the city is happening just south of our study area. really keeps progressing along the Market Frankfurt rapid transit line. So from one perspective, this would be a good thing for the neighborhood in that it hasn't seen investment in decades. But on the flip side, really, what does this mean for a neighborhood that is very low in income and very low levels of home ownership? So it's really something to consider. Accessibility is really great for this neighborhood. Next. You have easy access into some major job centers through public transit. You can get Center City or University City in under 20 minutes. Regionally, you can hop on a highway and be in your car in various other cities. Next. But at the same time, it's very easy to access the neighborhood, and that's something we've really seen be exploited by the drug trade. So when you consider all these factors, really the loss of jobs, the low income, vacant land and buildings, accessibility, you really have all the ingredients for an active drug market. And this neighborhood has really become at the center of the drug trade in Philadelphia. FBI has even gone to call it the largest open air drug market in the East Coast, so it's even really drawing regionally as well. Philadelphia Weekly has done some analysis of top drug corners in the city. When they first did it in 2007, there were about 2 out of the top 10. And by 2011, the next time they did the analysis, 8 of the top 10 drug corners have been in this immediate vicinity. And this is only concentrated in more recent times as the opioid crisis has gotten worse. You can really see there's a concentration of this on either side of the freight tracks, which are these sunken freight railroad. It was formerly very active, but currently rarely gets used in large wooded areas. On the embankments, this area has really become a haven for drug dealing, using, prostitution, other illicit activities. At its peak, there are up to 75 homeless drug users living along the tracks on any given night. This rail right-of-way has really gotten some national attention, and we'll get into that a little more detail later. Part of our analysis was to really look at some of the Philadelphia Police Department data and pinpoint some of these exact places within the neighborhood where crime was occurring. So this was in 2015. You can see a lot of that drug activity was concentrated in the southwest corner of our study area. And not surprisingly, the drug trade and gun violence really go hand in hand. So these are 2 heat maps of the city, and they really touch on similar areas. So not only are residents really dying from drug overdoses, in which there were about 1,200 in the city last year with a large concentration in this neighborhood. People are also dying from gun violence. So the green mark is homicides in 2006, and the red circles in the past year. So really, all told, there's been over 123 homicides in the past 10 years. So really, in many ways, this has a bigger impact on residents who are often caught in the crossfire and really scared to go out in their neighborhood. So throughout this process and learning from our client impact interactions with residents, it became very clear to us that residents have been traumatized. So either through shootings, overdoses, housing instability, and various other factors. Research shows that people who are traumatized are more likely to experience other negative issues at a higher rate. So things like mental health and physical disorders, substance abuse, domestic violence, things like that. There's been kind of a shift in understanding this solely at the individual level to recognize it at the community level. So in addition to addressing problems of people, there are interrelated factors such as the physical environment, equitable opportunity as well. So our approach was really to address the opioid problem in a comprehensive way. By doing this, we would have a better chance at lasting change. Well, yes, it's very important to consider the immediate needs of people dying through overdoses and gun violence without addressing some of those underlying issues like education levels and housing stability. it would really only be temporary change. So we took a strength-based approach, really to focus on specific opportunities and trying to tie that to potential partners. So this is really all done with the hope of building a more resilient neighborhood. Community resiliency is really made up of a few different components. So collective efficacy, social cohesion, shared expectations, control. But really it's about building community. So this is something that is lacking in the neighborhood in that sense at the community at really that block level. Part of that is that residents have no physical space to actually congregate with each other where they feel safe outside their homes. So the hope with our recommendations and implementation was to look at that block by block scale and really build up smaller micro communities where residents became advocates for their adjacent neighborhood. So really in order to do that, that strength-based approach, we began to document some of those assets. So this is just a map of some of that documentation, include things like former mill buildings, publicly owned land, other assets. We also tied that into many of the challenges the neighborhoods face. So places with high drug activity, large number of vacant lots. And using that analysis, we then broke the neighborhood down into what we called focus zones. So these were areas that had significant challenges, but also major assets and opportunities to build from, all while trying to build a sense of community at this smaller block by block level with engaged residents. So within these focus areas, it's where we began to take that comprehensive approach. In our case, we broke down recommendations and categorized it in 5 different ways. We did health and safety, education, economic development, housing, and community. We began to articulate specific recommendations, many of which touched on all of these categories and really tied it to partners who would then carry the plan out. So I'm going to walk you through some of the specific recommendations for one of those focus zones. In this case, it's the Hope Park area. So we started with a more detailed version of that assets and challenges maps in order to make targeted site-specific recommendations. So this is that same area just from a different perspective, from bird's eye view. So one of the first recommendations that needs immediate attention was really to address the submerged rail right-of-way we discussed earlier. It was important to think about short-term and long-term goals for this right-of-way. So when the project started, the area looked something like this. And as I mentioned before, there are about 75 homeless drug users living along the corridor. And since the project ended, the rail corridor looks like this. So since it ended, the city and Conrail, the owners, reached an agreement to clean up brush and garbage, as well as better restrict access. The city also set up mobile clinics for residents to get treatment they needed. Our client Impact Services really went a step further and extended the time frame for the clinic, made connections to other services, and to have a long-term lasting impact, Impact also reached a lease agreement with Conrail to turn parts of the right-of-way most adjacent to the neighborhood into a community space, really so that cleanup would have a longer lasting impact. Our next recommendation dealt with a large vacant industrial building. This was really critical to us because it was purchased and owned by our client, Impact Services. The beauty of these mill buildings is that they are very flexible, can serve a variety of the plan's goals, either through affordable housing or new workspace or community gathering space. Understanding that redevelopment of a building like this would take time, we thought of strategies in both the short term and long term, so what can be done immediately. Since the project ended, Impact coordinated with the Mural Arts Program and artist Tyree Gaitan. An art piece was done in collaboration with the community and touched on the issue of time in the changing neighborhood. In the meantime, Impact is working with architects and potential developer partners to determine the exact programmatic breakdown of this development with a strong emphasis on affordable housing and community space. There are 2 major drug corners just east of Hope Park. The recommendations included both physical and programmatic ones. From the physical side, a grant was received from Bank of America to make some physical improvements to the park, as well as clean up some of the vacant lots and buildings, which you can see in red. Impact's also working with numerous mentorship programs run by former dealers and formerly incarcerated residents to engage with dealers with the hope of helping them transition to more legitimate work. So it's really that tying in, making the space less conducive to drug dealing, as well as finding alternatives for dealers, is really critical to addressing the issue in this neighborhood. Impact's relationships with the neighborhood help to pinpoint blocks that have very engaged residents. Within this focus zone, we called out 3 specific blocks of what we call micro communities, so neighborhood groups organized at the block level. And we did a similar thing across the neighborhood. Within these blocks, Impact is working really to develop a structure to the work that residents are already doing. They're designating block captains, organizing regular meetings. Impact's also working to train block captains on leadership done through LISC's community connectors training. So it's really about building up and supporting engaged residents. A byproduct of this micro-communities concept was the expansion of play streets. This is a program run by the Philadelphia Parks Department. During the summer, streets are closed to vehicular traffic. Children can play, but also given a free lunch, which is very important during the summer where children don't get the lunch from school that they normally do. These were already found throughout the neighborhood, but are better being coordinated with those micro communities and block captains. And it's really a great way of building community and social cohesion. So those are really just a few of many examples of recommendations found in the plan, but I really just want to wrap it up with a few key takeaways. So this plan was always positioned as really a long-term neighborhood plan, but as work began, we soon recognized there was really an urgency to get things done because of the opioid crisis. So first, some of the major recommendations dealt with the opioid crisis head-on, examples being the rail right-of-way, but also things like naloxone training, things that save lives immediately. And that was really of utmost importance. But at the same time, really keep in mind some of those longer-term issues that are equally important, like housing stability, stable jobs, other things that can build a more resilient community. Another thing we found important was to technical improvements to programmatic ones. So if you clean up the rail right of way, but don't get users the treatment they need, the impact will really only be felt short term. Same can be said for drug corners. Fixing up vacant building makes a corner less conducive to dealing, but without engaging with the dealers and working with them to transition out of the drug trade, they will most likely just move somewhere else within the neighborhood. But finally, it's always good to have in mind potential partners who will administer the work. In our case, there were already some great organizations doing work in the neighborhood, so it was really a matter of connecting the dots of projects that had already been started. And that's really it. I'd like to thank everyone for allowing me to share our work. Hopefully it was informative. I'll turn it back over to Justin.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. And I just wanted to remind everyone that there is a Q&A at the end, and you can submit questions whenever you have them in the chat box on the right. So now I'll turn it over to Daniel.
Okay, thank you all for coming to this. I will do my best to confuse and confound you as much as possible regarding proper zoning, treatment of recovery residences and sober living homes. I am going to basically be compressing an hour-long presentation into 20 minutes. It's very important that we realize we cannot possibly win the war on drugs without sober homes and recovery communities, which are a type of community residence for people with disabilities. Sober homes have really sprung up all over the country, particularly in warm climate areas. And part of the problem is that there are a lot of scam operators running these homes. The way they're making their fortunes are by also running labs and charging $1,500 for a $50 drug test. The poster child for the scam operators is Kenny Chapman in Delray Beach, Florida, who is now serving 27.5 years, double his plea agreement for his misdeeds while running sober homes, which included enslaving some of the female residents of the sober homes in prostitution. He's not typical. The principle that we need to pay attention to, and I'll be coming back to this again later, is under the Fair Housing Act, cities and counties are required to make a reasonable accommodation in their zoning for community residences, which includes sober homes and recovery residences, for people with disabilities, which includes people in recovery. And taking all the cases together, which is important to do because the case law under zoning for group homes under the Fair Housing Act is very fact specific, is that the zoning protections that a city or county adopts need to be intended to achieve a legitimate government interest. They actually have to achieve that legitimate government interest, no pretending that they do. And it's got to be the least drastic means needed to achieve that legitimate government interest. We're looking at all this very carefully because the Fair Housing Amendments Act of 1988 added handicap to the list of protected classes. This is an act signed by President Ronald Reagan, something I always like to remind city councils and planning boards in very politically conservative cities. And it treated people with disabilities differently than all the other protected classes by adding this provision that discrimination includes a refusal to make reasonable accommodations in the rules, policies, and practices when needed to give people with disabilities equal opportunity to use and enjoy a dwelling. So what the act is doing is not to give people an advantage, as is often misinterpreted by some people in cities, over people without disabilities, but to level the playing field, because the people with disabilities can't live in the community, and this includes people in recovery, unless they have a group home or the broader term community residence living situation. The act also is intended to prohibit the use of such special requirements as conditional or special use permits. So it's very clear from the legislative history of the act that special use permits or conditional use permits are not the primary means to use to zone for community residences for people with disabilities. The act also, these transitions work much better when you're just in PowerPoint on your computer, by the way, folks. Whatever you do adopt, it cannot be based on false or overprotective assumptions or unfounded fears about the people with disabilities. These and similar practices are clearly prohibited by the Fair Housing Act. So whatever you adopt needs to be fact-based, which I guess is one of the reasons why when I'm rewriting zoning for a city, you first do a study that provides the basis for the zoning amendments. And these studies have strangely grown in the past year from 30 pages to about 65 pages. When it comes to figuring out what you can do with zoning for recovery residences, it's always good, as Vincini always said to Inigo Montoya and Fezzik in The Princess Bride, go back to the beginning. And that means going back to why group homes or community residences, to use the broader term, were allowed by the courts in residential districts even before the Fair Housing Amendment Act was passed in '88, adding people with disabilities. Number one is these group homes, including sober homes, emulate a biological family. The staff is in the role of the parents. The residents are in the role of the siblings. In the case of an Oxford house, the elected officers are in the role of the parents and the other folks in the role of the siblings. The goal of these homes is to achieve normalization and community integration, a concept that Wolf Wolfensberger came up with 100 years ago. Obviously, Wolf Wolfensberger's parents had a real sense of humor when it came to naming their kids. And to succeed, they need to be located in safe residential neighborhoods, but not clustered together or concentrated in a neighborhood. Part of what the reason for all this is what we know about community residences. There's been over 50 studies done on the impacts of them on property values, neighborhood safety, parking, traffic, demand, etc. And they have very consistently found that there are no adverse impacts created as long as they are not clustered together on a block face and they are licensed or certified. Now, clustering can occur when there's more than one or two on a block face. I would generally say in a block face, for those who don't remember the ancient term, is both sides of a street on a block. I would say that two homes on a block, particularly if they're serving different populations, likely won't cause any problems. Getting up to 3 or 4, it's a little uncertain, and that's when you really want to get into a case-by-case heightened scrutiny of a conditional use or special use permit as a secondary backup provision. So next slide. These homes do get clustered. A 1983 Government Accounting Office report found it was going on consistently. In Prescott, Arizona, where we redid the zoning and adopted a licensing law in collaboration with the city's wonderful attorney, John Palladini, there were over 220 sober homes, unlicensed, unregulated, in a town of 41,000. That's a lot. Delray Beach, which the New York Times has characterized as the epicenter of the sober home industry, had somewhere between 180 and 250 as of last summer, before the zoning and ordinance was adopted in July. This other Florida city, you can clearly see there is clustering. There are group homes being located close together. And that causes a problem because, as I will get into a little bit more clearly later, if you put the homes together, part of the whole idea of the group homes is to be in a residential area where the neighbors serve as role models, where you learn the so-called normal behavior from the so-called able-bodied people, and that's, I'm putting able-bodied in quotes. It's kind of like, if you remember the film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, where Jack Nicholson got an Oscar, I think largely for playing himself. The people in that home institution were learning how to live in an institution with mental illness. They were not learning the skills they needed to live in the community, either in a group home or on their own. So it's really kind of critical to get out of that institutional setting and get into as normalized a setting as possible. And that's very difficult to do if your neighbors are primarily or frequently people with the same disability. It's particularly a serious problem, I think, when it comes to recovery community residences or sober homes, where you could wind up just interacting with other people with the same condition. And that goes against the whole idea and underlying concept. So we come back to our underlying principle from all of the case law, all the court decisions, that whatever zoning we adopt, it's got to be actually achieve the legitimate government interests that it was aimed to achieve and be the least drastic means needed to do it. So your zoning provisions for community residences have to be very, very narrowly crafted. The aim of the zoning, whatever zoning you adopt, needs to be to protect the residents, the people who live in the community residences, from unscrupulous operators. And by protecting the people who live in the community residences, you are protecting the surrounding community as well. To prevent new concentrations that undermine the ability of community residences to achieve normalization and community integration from developing, and prevent existing concentrations from becoming more intense. Also, it is critical, and this is something a lot of cities I'm discovering don't grasp, but the zoning's got to treat all the community residences the same. You cannot have different zoning provisions for different types of community residences based on the nature of the disability. You can't have different local zoning standards based on the type of the disability. Now, just a quick aside, there's a fly in the ointment, statewide zoning statutes. 39 out of 50 states have some form of statewide zoning for group homes or community residences, but one, they are almost universally sloppily drafted, clearly the work of a lobbying special interest group. Two, no rational basis to them, especially when they're the ones that say you've got to treat these the same as a single family home. And three, they generally apply only to certain disabilities. In Arizona, for example, it's just for people with developmental disabilities. In other states, it's different disabilities. In Florida, it's 5 different groups, but they have licensing for most of the disabilities, but for sober homes, they have voluntary certification. So when you do draft such ordinances, I have found the thing to do is to put in an exclusion of in your provisions for except as required by state statutes. But there's a catch there because some of the state statutes have plainly illegal provisions in them. And those you should just plain ignore. They are not safe harbor. Any zoning you do starts with the definition of family. The courts have routinely tossed out zoning regulation of community residences, including spacing distances and licensing requirements under these circumstances. 1, if you have a definition of family that allows any number of unrelated people to live together as a single housekeeping unit. Think about it. If you require spacing between a group home when you have this definition of family or require it to get a license, that's facially discriminatory because you're not treating it the same as any other group of unrelated people living together. Same thing if there's no definition of family. Most zoning ordinances since the 60s limit the number of unrelated people who can live together. They have a cap on it, and that was sanctioned by the U.S. Supreme Court in the Belterre decision written by Justice Douglas, who was hardly a conservative. So you can limit. You could have a cap of, say, 3 people, unrelated people who can live together. So your zoning for group homes, as I'll show you in the next slide, I think, kicks in only for the group homes that are more than 3 people. They also are tossing the spacing and licensing out when the jurisdiction fails to conduct the research that provides a factual justification for the spacing and licensing requirements, either before they adopt the zoning ordinance, which is the time to do the study, or in court. So the zoning starts with the definition of family. And in our hypothetical city, let's assume it allows 3 unrelated people to live together. If you have a group home proposed for 3 or fewer people, it's a family allowed as of right in all residential districts. If your zoning ordinance doesn't have a cap on the number of unrelated or doesn't have a definition of family, forget about any zoning regulation of community residences for people with disabilities. Any zoning regulation in those circumstances is facially discriminatory. That's when spacing and licensing gets thrown out. In addition, if you try to apply spacing and licensing, in this case, on your screen, to a group home with 3 or fewer people, that would also be facially discriminatory. Awful lot of attorneys can't, just that distinction just seems to escape them, and I just don't know why. If the group proposed community residence exceeds 3 unrelated people, in this case, and virtually all sober homes do, because you want to have a larger number of people living together for a whole bunch of reasons that I can go to in the question and answer section. The zoning, that's when it's got to make a reasonable accommodation for these homes. And that's when it's got to use at least drastic means that actually achieves the legitimate government interest. This illustrates that approach. The proper way of handling this is to divide the group homes into 2 different types. One that offer relatively permanent tenancy, no limit on how long you live there and the rules of the home or in practice, and those that have relatively short-term tenancy in practice or by its rules. When we originally came up with the whole idea of spacing distances for group homes, we were dividing them by the number of people who live in the home. That is simply illegal now, absolutely improper, but let's view that back in 1974 as beta version 0.5. And we're now, in terms of zoning for group homes, up to version 2018. If a home, let's start on the left side with relatively permanent tenancy, you've got to allow these as of right in all residential districts. If they, as long as they are more than a rationally based spacing distance from any existing community residence, 660 feet is a typical block in America, so that's what I'm using here. I think you might be able to justify as much as a block and a half, but no more than that. These 1,200 foot, quarter mile, and half mile spacing distances are plainly illegal. And you got to allow it as of right as long as it's licensed, certified, or sanctioned by Congress. Oxford House, which is a type of self-governed community residence, has a annual certification process that is the equivalent of licensing and should be treated as licensed. If both criteria aren't met, then the heightened scrutiny of a conditional use permit is warranted. With relatively short-term homes, same sort of criteria, but I think it is perfectly legal. My conclusion after all these years is it's perfectly legal to require the heightened scrutiny of a conditional use permit to allow these short-term homes in single-family districts because their characteristics are so much closer to that of a multifamily housing with a higher turnover and such. I think it is perfectly reasonable to put a cap in your definition of a community residence of something like 10, 11, or 12 residents, because at some point you lose the ability to emulate a family. Again, remember what Sfizzini said in The Princess Bride, go back to the beginning. And it's very, with all due respect to the films Cheaper by the Dozen and Yours, Mine, and Ours, it's really hard to emulate a family when you start getting to 12, 13, 14 people. So if someone wants, if you set a cap of 10, then you would have a special reasonable accommodation process, very narrowly tailored to allow more than 10 residents where they have to really demonstrate that they are going to be able to function like a family. Back at the beginning, that you then might ask, well, how do we regulate the number of, control the number of people who live in the community residence besides that limit of 10? You go back to your building code or property maintenance code that has a provision to prevent overcrowding. Generally, it's along the lines of 70 square feet for the first occupant of a bedroom and 50 square feet for each additional occupant. This was sanctioned by the U.S. Supreme Court in the Edmunds decision, on which I'm very happy to say Brian Blazer and I wrote an amicus brief in support of the group home. APA was the only professional organization involved in government that filed an amicus in support of the group home. All the other government-oriented organizations, National League of Cities, ICMA, all of them filed amicus briefs against the group home and against the Fair Housing Act. So we can feel pretty proud of APA 22 years ago and being on the right side of history here and the ethical approach. So you use this requirement that applies to all community residences for people with disabilities. Finally, there's a situation that's cropping up all over the country where operators are starting to abandon the principled sober home approach and are creating these huge aggregations of people in recovery. In this slide from a city in Florida, the 4 buildings that have the colored roofs have a total of 96 people in recovery. This is quite a concentration, and there's no way you can call these community residences. They're mini institutions. Now, this is even more intense than the fact situation in the family style case under the Fair Housing Act. There they had 21 group homes expanding to 24, 119 people to 130, all within a block and a half of each other. The courts were concerned that the plaintiffs in this case were simply recreating, the operators, they were recreating an institutionalized setting rather than deinstitutionalizing the disabled. And that's what these aggregate living arrangements are involved. At the moment, I'm applying the term aggregate multi-unit living arrangement, which really rolls off the tongue smoothly, doesn't it? I have one client city that may become the first to adopt regulations on these. This is really going on all over the place. It's not just Southeast Florida or Arizona or California. It's even in Connecticut, where an operator is closing its group homes and putting everyone into a big institutionalized setting, claiming to be a residential setting when it's really a mini institution. And this is what happens when the big profit, big time businesses get involved in something that really should be a home-based business type of operation, where people in recovery are setting these up because the group home, sober homes saved their lives. So I realize my time is up. I'll do my best to answer any questions anyone might have. And please do not hesitate to visit the website grouphomes.law, where you can get the November 2015 Planning Magazine article on this, a 2-page summary of the maximum restrictions that you can apply to community residences, including sober homes and recovery residences, as well as my law review article, Rio Lulu, which, while it's 22 years old, seems to still be good and bizarrely is being referenced and cited in law review articles today. But don't be afraid of it. It's written in plain English, despite the best efforts of the law review articles editors to turn it into legal gobbledygook. So I turn it back to Justin.
Thank you. So just a reminder before we start the question and answer, all of the webinars in the series are available through APA's blog at this link, and you can forward any questions to Sagar Shah at the email below to reach APA's Healthy Communities Center. So starting with Jamie for the first question, there was a question about what efforts were taken in Kensington to ensure that drug dealing activities didn't go underground and resurface in other areas when you were looking to clean up that railroad area?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very valid concern and something that we thought about a lot. So our way of dealing with that was really to try to tie some of these physical improvements like cleaning up the rail or fixing up drug corners, really tie that with more programmatic things. So in the rail corridor, it was trying to get drug users treatment they needed. In the drug corners, really working towards mentorships and providing job opportunities and education levels, things that I wasn't exactly able to talk about, but things that are discussed further in the plan. So ideally, the hope was that, if you kind of get these people on a different path, they won't pop up in different neighborhoods or parts of the neighborhood. But with that said, this neighborhood really does have a brand. People from all over the region to the corner of Kensington Ave and Somerset in Philadelphia to buy drugs. So if you kind of break up that brand, the hope is maybe that some of these other places or neighborhoods that people aren't as aware of would be less successful. Not that is the end all, but it is something we considered.
Okay, great. I'll go back and forth with questions. So this one's for Daniel. From one of your slides, there was the question, how does Congress license, certify, or sanction group homes?
Okay, Congress is involved in the licensing or certification. That's done statewide or locally, but they do sanction group homes through their federal law that requires, they've sanctioned Oxford House about 30 years ago by federal law and require all states to provide funding to establish Oxford House like sober homes. Oxford House has been the most litigious under the Fair Housing Act and have won the most cases and brought the most cases. They have also been the most effective form of sober home out there. I believe the studies show that somewhere between 2/3 and 80% of the residents of Oxford houses, the graduates of Oxford houses 3 years later, are still clean and sober. That's an incredibly, wonderfully low recidivism rate.
Great. So another question for Jamie. In the Philadelphia case study, what types of alternative jobs were targeted?
So there's a few good examples of businesses in the neighborhood that directly hire formerly incarcerated residents. So that was kind of a few partners that we wanted to work with because that was an issue in this neighborhood, specifically in that people come back from prison and are unable to get jobs. There's also a developer in the neighborhood who does pretty socially conscious work. They've redeveloped some former mill buildings. They've gotten some food-related businesses to move in and created kind of these jobs that don't need high levels of education and are looking to hire locally. They also own a bunch of storefronts on Kensington Ave, which is kind of the main commercial drag in the neighborhood. They recently teamed up with the Commerce Department they called it the Kensington Storefront Challenge, where neighborhood residents were able to pitch business ideas to the developers who picked Some of these businesses gave them free rent in these places and some money to start their businesses. So it was really the idea of kind of tapping into that entrepreneurial spirit in the neighborhood and setting up some local businesses to create jobs as well. So those are just a few examples.
For Daniel, how can planners affect the dispersal of group homes?
Okay, well, the spacing distance is the primary tool. I mean, I just heard from someone with the Fair Housing Organization this morning who said a local town with 1,500 residences was concerned because they had 6 group homes all close to each other in one neighborhood, and they wanted to disperse them throughout the community. And the fair housing person's response was, well, wouldn't that be steering? No. You can, by using the spacing distance, you're going to, at least as of right, keep the homes from all congregating on just a couple of blocks and likely from in a single neighborhood. You certainly, and by having these homes as a permitted use in all residential districts, the family community residences at least, you open up the entire city to the community residences, which will disperse them as well. While a lot of operators will congregate towards the lower priced housing, there are operators that there's sufficient profit in this that they will also establish homes in higher priced neighborhoods as well. One of the key concerns is being in a safe neighborhood, because the people in the community residence are much more likely to be the victim of a crime than a perpetrator of a crime. So the spacing distance does seem to work pretty well. I know from our experience in Prescott, where, as I mentioned, they had 220 sober homes. Since the zoning and licensing laws were adopted, now it's 2 years since the licensing law was adopted, they went first from 220 to about 100 sober homes after the insurance industry cracked down on the scam artists. That has since fallen down to about 45. About 55 of them just pulled out stakes because they were sure they were scam artists. They could not meet the very rudimentary licensing requirements. The licensing ordinance in Prescott, the substance of it was just 8 pages long. Wasn't that demanding, but it provided protections for the people in the homes. And what's happened since then is 9 homes have gotten their licensing. The other 35 are going through the licensing process. If you, in some jurisdictions, by the way, if you want to use the statewide Association of Recovery Residences to handle your licensing or certification reviews, and Florida, the state, the politicians on the radical right, I'm afraid to say, wouldn't adopt statewide licensing, but instead they adopted voluntary certification for what cities are able to do. And I think Delray Beach was the first, is require that you get that certification to be able to operate. And the Florida Association of Recovery Residences has denied certification. And they are determined to put out of business the scam operators. And in fact, the executive director has been sued for libel by one of the scam operators. So it's going to vary state by state. But that, the spacing will lead to dispersal, prevent further concentration or more intense concentration. But you do have to allow that special use backup for those circumstances where someone wants to locate within spacing distance and it won't generate adverse impacts.
Thank you. For Jamie, was the public health department involved in your project, and can you please explain the role they had in the process and what type of partnerships were developed?
So I would say they were really indirectly involved. So there's a local organization in the neighborhood called Prevention Point, which we were strong partners with, and they work with Impact Services. Kind of started as a bill exchange, but now provide a variety of different treatment and services to in the drug trade. So while our plan was going on, Prevention Point was working with the health department on something the city called the Opioid Task Force. So a lot of our recommendations really pulled stuff from that Opioid Task Force and really targeted to very specific places within our neighborhood, some of these broader recommendations. So they weren't necessarily directly involved, but they were indirectly involved through Prevention Point.
Thanks. And for Daniel, there are a couple questions related to some of the legal classifications, both of family and of addiction being classified as a disability, and whether that is at the federal level or the state level, that's interpreted, whether that would vary state by state, either of those definitions, or whether that's a federal definition.
Okay, I'll take the second half first. People in recovery are definitely disabled. I actually dug up an old memo from 10 years ago. It's about 10 pages long, going through it in detail. The courts have been extremely clear, starting under the Americans with Disabilities Act, that people in recovery who are not are disabled. Under the Fair Housing Act, it adds the provision who are not currently using. So if someone is in recovery, but they start using, then the Fair Housing Act no longer protects them against housing discrimination. The definitions of family, that's a local thing, what you adopt at the local level. There may be some states that have some statewide laws regarding the definition of family. I really don't know off the top of my head. But it's at the local level. You have a choice of how you define family. And the thing that's creating issues right now are jurisdictions that don't want to define family at all because of the very many different ways that families are constituted today. And it's very hard to get it across to them. If you don't define family, then you're not going to be able to regulate community residences for people with disabilities at all, or those that don't want to have a cap on the number of unrelated people living together, who don't quite understand the Supreme Court said it's perfectly legal to have a cap, who just don't quite understand that then they can't regulate group homes at all either. It would be discriminatory on its face. If you want to talk about this further, my phone number was up there, my email address is there. Please contact me after tomorrow.
Okay. I think that takes us to 4 p.m. So just in an hour, thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you both for speaking. And again, everyone will receive the recorded webinar, and it will be available for continued learning. So you should be able to recommend it to your friends and colleagues if you found it valuable. Thanks again, everyone, for taking part in the series.